Podrick Payne had always been a quiet boy, the kind of lad who appeared insignificant at first glance. His face still bore the round softness of youth, and there was something perpetually innocent in his eyes, as if the world's cruelties had not quite taken root there. Even among the unpredictable politics of King's Landing, Podrick's unassuming presence had a way of making him easily overlooked. If ever a man or boy could wander the Red Keep's hallways with perfect invisibility, it was Podrick Payne. Servants would forget he was standing in corners waiting for Tyrion Lannister's orders, and guards rarely paid him more than a passing glance. He was often relegated to the background of tense discussions between lords and ladies who never spared him a second thought. He had first arrived in the service of Tyrion Lannister under less than auspicious circumstances. There had been some confusion with House Payne. Some said Podrick had been sent away to avoid shame after a family scandal, though never in his presence did anyone speak the details aloud. Tyrion had decided he might be useful, if only because the boy's last name held some weight. House Payne had a reputation, after all, especially due to Ser Island Payne, the king's justice. Tyrion expected little of Podrick, but discovered that the lad was loyal, polite, and surprisingly adept at small tasks, even if he was shy and often flustered. He didn't speak out of turn and rarely ventured an opinion unless pressed. For a time, that was enough for Tyrion, who assumed he had found an agreeable shadow that would not inconvenience him with disobedience. Little did anyone realize that beneath Podrick's quiet surface simmered a keen mind. He was observant beyond the normal measure for a squire. The boy seemed to notice even the smallest interactions between the lords and ladies of the court. He recognized the subtle shifts in expression, the pregnant pauses, the flicker of surprise or cunning in a man's eyes. These tiny details stuck in Podrick's memory until he could piece them together like a tapestry. The tapestry of King's Landing was woven with intrigue, schemes, and whispered secrets that Podrick caught in passing. He might be in the hall, holding Tyrion's cloak, or waiting with a pitcher of wine, and all the while, half forgotten by those who spoke freely. As time went on, Podrick began to comprehend that the Game of Thrones was not only played by the highborn, the wealthy, or the cunning. Anyone, if subtle and patient enough, could place themselves upon the board. And Podrick was very subtle, and more patient than most. He had grown fond of Lord Tyrion. The imp had been kind to him in moments, teaching him about swords and sharing a few secrets about women. But even so, Podrick kept quiet about all that he truly observed. He noticed how Tyrion and Varys spoke to one another with mutual respect but also constant suspicion. He saw the soft, secret glances exchanged in the Red Keep's corridors, the pouches of coin changing hands in the shadows. He saw the small but consequential nods that signaled alliances. He heard the whispers of discontent in the city as war and famine had come and gone. He recognized that, though lords wielded the greatest official power, those who controlled whispers, like Varys, could rise to immeasurable influence. Podrick, in his young mind, eventually formed a single audacious thought. Why couldn't he, too, find a way to hold such power? Why must he always stand behind others, serving, listening, never deciding his own fate? A spark lit within him. He thought of it often, usually late at night when he slipped under rough woolen blankets, his heart fluttering at the idea that he could become more than a mere squire. He told no one, not even Bronn, who sometimes teased him but treated him with a bizarre sort of brotherly fondness. For all his external docility, Podrick began to cultivate an ambition that simmered like a low fire, waiting for the right fuel. At first, it was merely a game of observation. Whenever Tyrion met with Varys, Podrick ensured he was in the room, or just outside the door, or strolling discreetly through a nearby corridor. He developed the skill of walking silently, which had always come rather naturally to him, and found vantage points behind pillars or tapestries. He learned to hold his breath for long stretches, to still his restless feet so they wouldn't make the slightest scuff on the cold marble floors. In this manner, he listened to the way Tyrion tried to pick Varys's brain about the politics of the Seven Kingdoms, listened to the way Varys offered half-truths in that lilting, polite voice of his. He learned to note the difference between what Tyrion thought was true and what Varys actually implied was true. It was a dance of deception, and Podrick became adept at following their subtle steps. Meanwhile, King's Landing bustled with the usual drama. The lords vied for position. The small folk starved in the streets. Rumors spread about new claims to the throne. Tyrion's star was waxing and waning depending on who held the hand's seat at any given time. Varys drifted as he always did, pledging loyalty to the realm, though no one really believed such neutrality existed in a place as treacherous as the capital. Jaime Lannister, Cersei, the Tyrells, and others all had their roles. Through it all, Podrick remained the quietly loyal squire, rarely separated from Tyrion's shadow. Yet, in unguarded moments, Podrick noted every loose thread, each unheeded vulnerability. It helped that Podrick was disarmingly meek. People confided small things in him because they saw him as guileless. Servants told him gossip. Low-ranking guards joked about who was sleeping with whom. The Red Keep's kitchens buzzed with rumors about the Queen's latest tantrum or the lords who arrived with demands. Podrick collected each morsel of knowledge like a squirrel collects nuts before winter. Gradually, a picture formed in his mind, one that even Varys might not fully see. For Varys had to rely on little birds, many of whom were children or disguised informants, while Podrick's advantage lay in his direct access to Tyrion's inner circle and the near invisibility that came from being an inconsequential figure. He learned the patterns of Tyrion's daily schedule, when Tyrion attended council meetings, which brothels he frequented, who he trusted for real advice versus those he manipulated for short-term benefit. Podrick also began to map Varys's sphere of influence. Varys would steal away at unexpected hours, presumably to meet one of his little birds or plot something that might benefit the realm or himself. Whenever Varys left the Red Keep, Podrick paid attention to the route of his departure, the color of his clothes, for disguises, of course, and the direction of his carriage or footsteps. The spider's web was wide indeed, but Podrick worked diligently on weaving a smaller, more intimate net, specifically designed to catch both the spider and the imp in its threads if the moment was ever right. In doing so, Podrick discovered that King's Landing was ripe for another wave of chaos. The war had taken its toll on the city, the people were restless, and the Lannisters' hold was tenuous despite their wealth. The populace whispered that the crown's debts were staggering, that even the Iron Bank of Bravos might soon come to collect. Hungry crowds would gather in Flea Bottom, eyeing the Red Keep with growing resentment. Rumors of foreign invaders filtered in, slavers from Essos, new warlords, or perhaps even the dragons of Daenerys Targaryen, though no one could confirm exactly which corner of the seas she might sail from. In short, the realm stood on a precipice. All it would take was a sharp push for the entire city to fall into turmoil. Podrick's first real step toward changing his fortunes came one evening as he accompanied Tyrion to a clandestine meeting. The meeting took place in a dilapidated mansion near the Street of Silk, one that had belonged to a minor lord long since bankrupted by the war. The structure groaned under the weight of rot and dust, but Tyrion had chosen it for precisely that reason. It was unlikely anyone would pay attention to a small group of men entering a deserted building. Varys, of course, was there, along with Bronn and two hooded figures Podrick did not recognize. Tyrion had only told Podrick to stay near the door and keep watch. Podrick nodded obediently and said nothing. He obeyed as he always did. The conversation in that forlorn, candlelit room was about forging an alliance with certain powerful bankers from Essos, men who could influence the Iron Bank or redirect a portion of their funds. Tyrion wanted to free himself from the crown's suffocating debts. Varys was more cautious, concerned about the repercussions if they were seen dealing with Braavosi associates in secret. The hooded men offered vague promises of financial relief in exchange for certain favors that went unspoken but were clearly dangerous. The meeting ended with no firm agreement, and the visitors slipped away into the night. Bronn escorted Tyrion to his litter, complaining about the damp stench of the place, while Varys departed in his usual mysterious manner. Podrick, for his part, had lingered in the mansion's hallway long enough to glean a crucial detail. Tyrion was desperate for gold, more desperate than he cared to let on. He was not content to rely on the Lannister name alone. There was something else, too, an air of agitation in Tyrion that Podrick rarely witnessed. The imp was always a mixture of cynicism and wit, but tonight he had been tense, almost fearful. That alone was enough to make Podrick wonder about the extent of Tyrion's secrets. He considered that if Tyrion's finances were vulnerable, perhaps there were threads that Podrick could pull. Threads that might eventually unravel Tyrion's power base. For the next few months, Podrick quietly took on additional errands. Whenever Tyrion needed a letter delivered, Podrick volunteered. He insisted that he could be discreet, and Tyrion, seeing no harm, allowed it. Podrick carried sealed letters across the city, noticing to whom he was delivering them. Certain merchants, lesser nobles who lived in the shadow of grand houses, and occasionally to suspicious addresses in Flea Bottom. Podrick's skill in reading was minimal, but he was learning with each letter he was given to practice upon. He didn't dare open Tyrion's letters, for Tyrion would surely notice if seals were broken. Instead, Podrick memorized the addresses, the codes on the outside, and the frequency with which Tyrion wrote. If a letter arrived from a merchant who seemed to pester Tyrion for faster repayment, Podrick took note of the man's desperation in his voice. The more Podrick observed, the clearer the shape of Tyrion's precarious finances became. It was around this time that Podrick realized Varys was watching him. He felt the spider's gaze more than saw it, a prickle at the back of his neck as if he were being sized up. Varys never accused him or questioned him, but Podrick could sense the man's curiosity. Why was Podrick so often out and about, delivering messages alone? Why did Podrick sometimes slip into the lesser-traveled halls of the Red Keep at hours when most squires were asleep? Podrick, aware of the risk, tried to keep his routine as inconspicuous as possible. He fumbled intentionally in front of others, playing the part of the awkward boy who spilled wine or tripped over a raised floor tile. He sought to camouflage his intelligence behind a mask of mild incompetence. And indeed, when Varys made passing conversation with him, "How are you this evening, Podrick?" Podrick gave answers so plain and timid that Varys would lose interest. But Podrick knew the master of whisperers was not easily duped. If Varys suspected him of anything, it would be wise to feed him scraps of false information. One evening, as Podrick strolled back toward the Tower of the Hand, he spied Varys drifting through an adjacent corridor, floating like a phantom in pastel silk robes. The man's eyes flickered toward Podrick, then away. Podrick's heart pounded, but he maintained a slow, casual pace. It was the first time he felt a real threat to his budding ambitions. Varys was a formidable foe, perhaps the single most dangerous man in the Red Keep if cunning and manipulation were the weapons. To challenge him would require methodical planning, layers of deception, and absolute secrecy. Though fear gnawed at him, Podrick did not waver. Instead, he decided to double down on his efforts. He mapped out which of Tyrion's associates could be bought by coin, by promises, or by gentle blackmail. Quietly, Podrick made acquaintances among the servants who owed gambling debts, among the lesser guards who nursed resentment toward their superiors. He listened to their problems, their frustrations, their petty grievances. At first, Podrick said only a few comforting words. Later, he offered little pouches of coins he pilfered from Tyrion's table or won by chance. These small acts of kindness planted seeds of loyalty. He never asked for their direct treachery, only the occasional favor. "Could you let me know if so-and-so arrives at the keep?" Or, "Might you tell me if Lord Tyrion meets with Lord Baelish tomorrow?" Often, they complied just to repay a good-natured boy who seemed eager to please and had shown them a kindness. It was so simple, Podrick marveled, to build a personal network of watchers when people believed you were harmless. It was in this manner that Podrick began to cultivate an information web that mirrored Varys's own. It was nowhere near as extensive, of course, but it was targeted. He cared little for the rumors about Dorne or the succession crises in far-off corners of the realm. He wanted tangible leverage inside the Red Keep. He wanted to know exactly when Tyrion met with certain individuals and what might transpire. So he asked for only what he needed and made sure never to overextend himself. If a whisper reached him that Varys's spies were prowling too close, Podrick would go silent for a spell, feigning sickness or fatigue to remain out of sight, letting suspicion wane. All this time, King's Landing felt the tension of an uncertain future. The population was swelling again as war refugees returned. The city's resources were stretched thin, and the Lannisters' hold on the throne was not as ironclad as it once seemed. Queen Cersei was prone to paranoia. Her fits of anger were known to strike fear in the hearts of courtiers. Jaime Lannister was often away on some errand or other, leaving the queen to rely on her wits and her manipulations. She still saw Tyrion as a threat, though with Tywin Lannister dead, Tyrion's position was less stable than before. Still, the imp possessed uncanny resilience and had survived many attempts to diminish his influence. Amid this, Podrick remained Tyrion's squire, serving quietly but always watching, listening. He kept his head bowed when Varys was near, not wanting to reveal the thoughts that roiled behind his placid face. He had begun to envision a scenario in which he could upend them both, Tyrion and Varys, and take for himself a measure of power that no one would see coming until it was too late. But how exactly could a squire, even one with secrets, orchestrate something so grand? Opportunity came in the form of a new alliance proposal with House Tyrell. Margaery Tyrell had already been queen to the late King Joffrey, then King Tommen, entangling the Tyrells and the Lannisters in a fraught alliance. In the aftermath of betrayals and shifting loyalties, the Tyrells were disgruntled with the Lannisters but still reliant on them to maintain a foothold near the throne. Tyrion, seeing an opportunity to restore his family's coffers, sought to broker a lucrative trade deal with the Tyrells to bring in shipments of grain and produce from the Reach, ensuring the capital would be fed. But it required a delicate balance of negotiations, and Tyrion needed all the cunning he could muster to ensure the Lannisters didn't end up at the Tyrells' mercy. Varys, for his part, subtly encouraged the meeting. The Master of Whisperers claimed the city's peace depended on a stable alliance. This was not a falsehood. A hungry population was a dangerous one, and famine would drive the small folk to riot. But Podrick sensed Varys had other motives. Perhaps the Spider wanted the Tyrells to strengthen their position, or perhaps he intended to sow mistrust that he could later exploit. Whatever the truth, both Tyrion and Varys seemed intent on finalizing some kind of arrangement. The negotiation was set to occur at the Red Keep itself. In a private dining hall draped with crimson and gold, servants laid out a lavish feast. Margaery Tyrell would be in attendance, along with her grandmother Lady Olenna, who was known to be as sharp as any man in King's Landing. Tyrion prepared meticulously, drafting speeches and terms. He asked Podrick to run back and forth with messages all day prior to the feast, ensuring that every detail was perfect. Podrick obliged, weaving through the corridors with a docile smile and wide eyes, all the while memorizing each snippet of conversation he overheard. That evening, as the feast began, Podrick loitered among the servants in the corner. The table was adorned with succulent meats, fresh fruits from the Reach, and flagons of rich arbor wine. Margaery arrived in a gown of emerald green, every inch the gracious queenly figure she'd once been. Lady Olenna, seated beside her granddaughter, wasted no time in trading barbs with Tyrion, referencing past humiliations and making sly remarks about Lannister pride. Tyrion countered with politeness so sugary it was nearly acid. Varys sat to one side, smiling benignly at the jests, while Cersei was conspicuously absent, claiming a sudden headache or some other contrivance. Without Cersei's poisonous presence, the mood was calmer, though the tension remained. As the evening wore on, the conversation turned to matters of trade and debts. Tyrion laid out the benefits the crown could offer in exchange for a generous supply of grain at a lower cost. Lady Olenna narrowed her eyes, examining him like a hawk, seeking any sign of weakness. Margaery's soft voice interjected occasionally, pointing out that the people of King's Landing deserved fair prices, that they had suffered enough. Tyrion agreed, layering on compliments that the Tyrells were the true saviors of the realm. The dance continued, each side prodding the other for a concession. Varys chimed in with a gentle reminder that unity was paramount, especially with rumors of new threats on the horizon. Throughout it all, Podrick stood near the back, pouring wine when needed, discreetly refilling Tyrion's cup at all the right moments. But Podrick's attention wasn't just on Tyrion. He watched Margaery and Lady Olenna closely. He saw Lady Olenna's shrewdness, the way her gaze flickered to Tyrion's right hand, to the rings he wore, to the subtle signs that might indicate how much gold the Lannisters truly had left. Podrick realized Olenna was testing Tyrion's financial desperation. In a single moment, Podrick understood that Olenna's well-informed suspicion might become a valuable tool. If the Tyrells discovered the Lannisters were weaker than presumed, they could push for an even more advantageous arrangement, or threaten to withhold shipments altogether. Varys, too, must have noticed this. Podrick saw the quick glance exchanged between the Master of Whisperers and Lady Olenna, a look that said Varys was aware of Olenna's line of thinking. Perhaps they had an arrangement behind the scenes. Perhaps Varys hoped to tip the balance in favor of the Tyrells for reasons of his own. If so, Tyrion was at a disadvantage. Podrick inhaled slowly, considering how best to use what he saw. The feast ended late into the night, with no final agreement reached but with promises of further meetings. Wine-drowsy lords stumbled off, and ladies withdrew to their chambers. Tyrion, exhausted, dismissed Podrick after complimenting his attentive service. Yet Podrick did not go straight to bed. Instead, he circled through the servants' corridors, quietly asking if Lady Olenna had returned to her temporary quarters in Maegor's Holdfast. One servant told him that Olenna and Margaery had gone to the royal gardens for some air. Another said they had parted ways, with Margaery returning to the Queen's apartments while Olenna took a short walk. Podrick found the Dowager Lady of Highgarden strolling alone in the gardens, her cane tapping softly on the stone paths, her posture defiant. She seemed deep in thought, and the lamp in her hand cast a long shadow over the hedges. Podrick stayed behind a row of carefully pruned bushes, not daring to approach directly. But he was close enough to hear Olenna muttering under her breath. "Fool Lannisters, always puffing their chests while their vaults run empty. The day is coming when we needn't coddle them anymore. The upstart dwarfs and lions that roar with no bite left." In that moment, an idea came to Podrick, so audacious that he nearly stepped on a branch in surprise. Perhaps Lady Olenna could be the key to undermining Tyrion's grip. If Tyrion was forced into a desperate position, if the Tyrells discovered how precarious his finances truly were, they might make demands that even Tyrion couldn't satisfy. And in that desperation, perhaps Tyrion would overstep, betray someone, or make a mistake. The trick, of course, was to orchestrate it so that blame would not fall on Podrick, but on Tyrion himself. He spent a sleepless night in his small chamber, lying on a thin mattress stuffed with straw, formulating the seed of a plan. Come morning, he set about his usual tasks, tending to Tyrion's clothes, polishing his boots, but his mind was whirring. He would need to feed Olenna just enough correct information to confirm her suspicions, but in a way that did not implicate him overtly. Then, as Tyrion scrambled to handle the fallout, Varys would step in, hoping to manipulate events. That would be the moment Podrick could move against Varys. One coup was not enough. He needed them both to fall in a masterstroke that would go unnoticed as his own handiwork until it was too late. The first opportunity arose when Tyrion asked Podrick to deliver a letter to the steward of the royal library, a letter referencing certain historical records that might be used to buttress the Lannisters' claims to certain farmland near the Blackwater Rush. Tyrion believed those claims, if legitimized by official documentation, could be sold or mortgaged to raise desperately needed coin. As Podrick left Tyrion's solar with the letter, he paused in the corridor, reading the outside address. He could not read the interior text, but the address itself was enough to confirm what Tyrion was after. Quietly, Podrick found one of the guards he had befriended, a man named Pell who owed him after Podrick had given him a silver stag to cover a gambling loss. Podrick asked Pell if he could slip the knowledge of Tyrion's request to one of Olenna's handmaidens, who was rumored to be pliable for a few coins. Pell hesitated, but Podrick insisted it was only a small rumor, nothing serious. Pell eventually shrugged and agreed. That small rumor did its work. A day later, Podrick heard from another servant that Lady Olenna had made inquiries into the farmland near the Blackwater Rush, verifying that the Lannisters' claim was unsteady at best. Podrick felt a small thrill. He had taken his first step, leaking a hint of Tyrion's vulnerability to the Tyrell matriarch. There would be no cause to suspect Podrick. The rumor was so innocuous it could have come from any number of the Red Keep's denizens. Yet if Olenna decided to press Tyrion, it could unbalance him considerably. Sure enough, at the next meeting between Tyrion and Olenna, tension crackled in the air like a coming storm. Olenna prodded Tyrion with cutting questions, each one revealing that she knew more about his plans than he had expected. Tyrion masked his surprise, but beads of sweat glistened on his brow. Varys observed silently, a small, mysterious smile on his face. Podrick served wine, quietly studying their expressions. He saw the flash of anger in Tyrion's eyes, the triumph in Olenna's, and Varys's intense curiosity at how Olenna had discovered such inside knowledge. Tyrion tried to keep the meeting cordial, but it ended in an uneasy truce, with neither side willing to concede. In the aftermath, Tyrion was in a foul mood. He summoned Varys to his chambers, presumably to discuss how such sensitive information had leaked. Podrick was dismissed before the conversation began, but he hovered outside, ear pressed to the heavy oak door as best he could manage without detection. He caught snatches of Tyrion's furious whispers, something about loose tongues and servants. Varys responded soothingly, promising to investigate, though how sincere that promise was, Podrick could not tell. He suspected Varys was secretly pleased to see Tyrion so unsettled, for it opened new avenues of manipulation. Podrick's caution urged him not to move too quickly. He needed to let tensions simmer. Meanwhile, he continued to cultivate small alliances among the Red Keep staff, offering a kindly ear or a small coin when it was needed most. To some, he gave no coin at all, just a sympathetic shoulder and a few compliments. He learned that genuine attention could be as valuable as gold to someone who felt invisible and unappreciated. In return, those servants whispered back to him the comings and goings of Varys, the private instructions Tyrion gave them, and the occasional rumor about what Cersei was planning. He discovered, for instance, that Varys had been paying visits to the black cells where certain political prisoners were held. Why? No one was certain, but some guessed he might be questioning them or offering them deals in exchange for information on disloyal nobles. Podrick also heard that Tyrion was beginning to hoard certain valuables in a locked chest in his solar: golden cups, jeweled daggers, small ornaments that might be sold in secret. These details Podrick stored away, awaiting the perfect moment to use them. Weeks passed, and the tension between Tyrion and Olenna reached a new peak when Olenna threatened to cut off the city's supply of grain unless Tyrion provided a large sum of gold up front. Tyrion, outraged, accused her of extortion. Olenna retorted that the Lannisters were drowning in debt and that the Tyrells refused to rescue them out of sheer charity. Varys tried to soothe matters, claiming that an arrangement could be reached that would satisfy all parties. Margaery, ever diplomatic, attempted to calm her grandmother's iron will. Yet it was apparent that Tyrion was losing control of the negotiations. The city itself teetered on the brink of shortages if no solution was found. That was precisely when Podrick decided to strike with his second strategic leak. This time, he planted information suggesting that Tyrion was considering negotiating with the Iron Bank directly behind the Tyrells' backs. He had no proof of it, but he crafted the rumor carefully, hinting that the Iron Bank had sent an emissary to speak with Tyrion in the darkest hours of the night. In truth, Tyrion would never dare such a risky move without announcing it to the court or at least clearing it with the crown. But all Podrick needed was for the Tyrells to believe it was possible. With tension so high, Lady Olenna's suspicions would run rampant. Through a series of intermediaries, servants who owed him favors, or individuals who were ready to believe anything ill of the Lannisters, Podrick planted the seed that an Iron Bank representative had been skulking about the Red Keep. Sure enough, the rumor made its way to Olenna's ears, and within days, the negotiation table exploded in accusations. Tyrion, blindsided, denied it vehemently, but Olenna demanded an explanation. She went so far as to threaten to withdraw all Tyrell presence from the capital if Tyrion was preparing to undercut their arrangement. Tyrion, incensed, declared that no such emissary existed, that Olenna was grasping at shadows. And somewhere in the corner of that chamber, Podrick quietly refilled wine cups, head bowed, eyes as round and innocent as ever. The confrontation ended abruptly with Lady Olenna storming out, Margaery trailing behind, pleading for calm. Tyrion stood trembling with rage while Varys regarded him with a thoughtful expression, as though measuring how best to exploit this. Podrick knew the next few days would be critical. Tyrion would scour the Red Keep for the source of these rumors, Varys would cast his net wider, and Olenna would possibly consider more drastic measures. The city's fragile peace wobbled, and Podrick was determined to keep pushing it toward outright crisis, but in a way that allowed him to remain unseen. Sure enough, that evening, Varys approached Podrick in a dimly lit corridor. The boy had been on his way to fetch fresh linens for Tyrion's chambers when the Master of Whisperers appeared, seemingly out of nowhere. "Good evening, Podrick," Varys said softly, his voice as smooth as satin. "Still so diligent in your tasks, I see." Podrick bowed his head. "Yes, my lord. I serve Lord Tyrion as best I can." "Indeed. He is fortunate to have a squire so loyal." Varys paused, the corners of his mouth corking up. "I wonder, do you ever hear things, Podrick? Small things, perhaps, whispered among the servants or passed along in the courtyard?" Podrick swallowed. I hear the usual gossip, my lord. Nothing that would concern a man as wise as you." Varys clasped his hands. "You are too modest. Even the smallest whisper can hold great importance. And you, Podrick Payne, have a knack for being in places others do not notice." He let the statement hang in the air. Podrick willed his heart not to thunder so loudly. He dipped his head again, forcing a stammer into his voice. I only go where Lord Tyrion sends me. I do my best not to intrude on matters above my station." Varys's eyes gleamed in the torchlight. "Of course you do. And yet, if you should ever overhear anything that might be of importance to the realm, I do hope you'd consider sharing it with me. Your loyalty to Lord Tyrion is admirable, but your loyalty to the realm must also be considered. Wouldn't you agree?" Podrick nodded slowly, as though intimidated and unsure. "Yes, my lord. I would do what's right for the realm." "Wonderful," Varys said, his voice barely above a whisper. Then he leaned in. "And let me give you a small piece of advice, my dear boy. The realm can be a dangerous place, especially for those who grow too bold, too quickly. Best to tread carefully." With that, Varys bowed his head in a gesture of farewell and drifted away, his robes trailing behind him like the tail of a phantom. Podrick stood alone in the corridor, blood pounding in his ears. A threat, thinly veiled, but unmistakable. Varys either suspected or outright knew that Podrick was meddling. He was warning the boy to cease, or at least to think carefully about his next moves. For a moment, Podrick felt genuine fear. Varys was a master at rooting out conspiracies, and if he decided to crush Podrick, the boy would have little defense. But Podrick also felt a surge of determination. He had come too far to turn back now. He thought of that faint flicker of ambition he'd nurtured for so long. He refused to let it die simply because Varys had caught wind of him. If anything, the confrontation steeled his resolve. He would have to be more cunning, more precise, more ruthless. In the following days, Podrick laid low. He performed his duties to perfection, giving Tyrion no cause for complaint, and avoided crossing paths with Varys. He made sure to appear nervous and distracted whenever he saw the Master of Whisperers, reinforcing the impression that Podrick was nothing but a timid boy spooked by a powerful lord's scrutiny. Meanwhile, the city's mood darkened. The rumor that the Tyrells might cut off shipments caused fear among the small folk. Prices soared in the markets, and bread riots threatened to erupt in Flea Bottom. Tyrion scrambled to reassure merchants and keep the peace, while also trying to appease the Tyrells. All the while, Podrick searched for the final weapon he needed to bring Tyrion down. A piece of evidence or a fabricated letter that would irreparably damage Tyrion's standing. Preferably something that would implicate Varys as well. If he could convince both the Tyrells and the crown that Tyrion and Varys were involved in a conspiracy to defraud the crown or betray its interests, both men could be disgraced, arrested, or worse. And in the chaos, perhaps Podrick could step forward as a loyal informant to the realm, earning him the patronage of someone powerful, like Lady Olenna or even the Queen herself. In a stroke of fortune, Podrick stumbled upon something potentially explosive. Late one evening, as he passed Tyrion's study, He noticed the door ajar and the solar empty. Light from a nearby torch revealed a corner of parchment on Tyrion's desk. Podrick could see the wax seal of a Braavosi banker. Heart hammering, he crept inside. The letter spoke of an ongoing negotiation for a loan, naming Tyrion directly. Podrick could not decipher every word, but he recognized enough references to interest rates and collateral to know that Tyrion was indeed in deep negotiations with the Braavosi. If Lady Olenna knew that Tyrion was circumventing her, if the crown discovered that Tyrion was personally indebted to Braavosi bankers in a way that might compromise the realm's finances, it would be a scandal. Podrick replaced the letter as best he could, memorizing every name he saw. Then he slunk back into the shadows. Over the next few days, he carefully constructed a false trail. He procured scraps of parchment and forged, in a shaky hand, a partial letter referencing secret deals with Bravos, peppering it with details gleaned from the real letter. He signed it with a forged version of Tyrion's signature. Podrick was no master forger, but he did not need perfection. He only needed something convincing enough to sow the final seeds of doubt in the Tyrells and the crown. After finishing the forgery, Podrick tested how it might look if discovered at a glance. He reasoned that no one would subject it to a deep analysis if the circumstances of its discovery were sufficiently dramatic. But how to ensure it reached the right hands at the right time without implicating himself? Podrick mulled this question for days. Then another golden opportunity arose. Lady Olenna invited Tyrion to her private apartments for a final round of negotiations. She demanded only Tyrion's presence, no other lords, claiming it was to keep matters discreet. Tyrion reluctantly agreed, hoping to salvage the alliance. On the appointed evening, Tyrion set off alone, but Podrick, citing some urgent matter of housekeeping, managed to slip into the corridor near Olenna's quarters shortly before Tyrion arrived. He positioned himself behind a lavish tapestry, waiting. He clutched the forged letter in his sweaty palms, heart racing so violently he feared it would give him away. Soon he heard Tyrion's voice, muffled, greeting Olenna's guard. Then the door closed. Podrick counted to 100, then emerged. He walked deliberately to the guard, speaking in a low voice. "I have a message for Lady Olenna from Lord Varys," he lied, showing the guard a folded parchment that bore the forged letter. "It's urgent." The guard eyed the seal. It was no seal at all. Podrick had only dripped a bit of candle wax. But in the dim corridor, the man seemed not to notice the difference. "I'll ask her ladyship if you can enter," the guard said. Podrick nodded gratefully, slipping the letter into the guard's hand. "I was told it must be delivered to her ladyship directly." The guard grumbled, but given the gravity of the ongoing negotiations, he had little reason to suspect Podrick, who was, after all, Lord Tyrion's squire. He stepped inside, leaving Podrick in the corridor. That was all Podrick needed. The letter would pass into Olenna's hands at the worst possible time for Tyrion, or so he hoped. He had laced the text with lines referencing a scheme to keep the Tyrells off balance while negotiating a more favorable loan from the Iron Bank. It was designed to look like Tyrion and Varys were colluding to bankrupt the Tyrells once their gold was drained. If Olenna believed it, even for a moment, she would erupt in fury. Podrick retreated down the corridor, forcing himself not to run, not to appear suspicious. He didn't linger, didn't wait. He knew that in a short while chaos might ensue, and he wanted to be as far from the epicenter as possible. He headed back toward Tyrion's chambers, prepared to act as though nothing was amiss. Sure enough, not an hour later, the corridors echoed with raised voices. A few servants scurried past, murmuring that Lady Olenna had expelled Tyrion from her apartments, calling him a treacherous imp. Tyrion had retorted with a fury rarely seen, swearing by the old gods and the new that he was being framed. The entire household buzzed like a disturbed beehive. By the time Tyrion reached his own solar, Podrick was already there, standing at attention, looking worried. Tyrion burst in, face red, eyes wild. "This is madness," Tyrion exclaimed, pacing furiously. "She showed me this letter claiming it was from me and Varys. A damned forgery if I've ever seen one. But she claims, my handwriting or some foolery. She won't even discuss it rationally. She's gonna walk away from the table, end everything. If that happens, if the Tyrells cut us off. Podrick bit his lip, summoning the perfect blend of concern and deference. "And my lord, is there anything I can do? Shall I?" "No, confound it," Tyrion snapped, then caught himself. "God's not at you, Pod. Just the situation. It's all unraveling. Someone's orchestrating this." He stopped, glaring at the shadows, as though they might reveal his enemy. "But who?" Podrick blinked. He forced his voice to tremble slightly. "Could it be Lord Varys, my lord? He's so clever." Tyrion shook his head. "Varys rarely acts so clumsily, but perhaps, or Cersei or Baelish if that weasel is still creeping about, or one of the Tyrells themselves, setting me up to force better terms." He raked his hands through his hair. "I need to speak with Varys immediately." With that, Tyrion stormed out again, presumably to hunt down the Master of Whisperers. Left alone, Podrick let out a shaky breath. So far, his plan had worked. Olenna believed Tyrion was plotting behind her back, and Tyrion suspected an unknown foe was out to ruin him. Sooner or later, Tyrion and Varys would turn on each other in a swirl of suspicion, or the crown would turn on both if their squabbles threatened the realm. The small folk, already disgruntled, might riot the moment grain prices soared again. In the ensuing bedlam, Podrick would be the quiet orchestrator, the invisible hand. Yet the lad's ambition did not stop with Tyrion's downfall. He hungered for a new patron, a new place in the hierarchy. He imagined himself stepping forward at the right moment, with crucial knowledge that could either incriminate or exonerate key players. He could choose who to side with, maybe the Tyrells if that gave him immediate advantage, or Cersei if the queen seemed more desperate for allies. He considered that Cersei would likely be more paranoid, and the Tyrells might be easier to manipulate if they saw him as a victim of Lannister treachery. Though, in truth, the largest threat remained Varys. The spider would not be easily undone by a single forged letter. He might suspect the Tyrells of forging it. He might suspect Tyrion. Or, if he was clever enough, and Podrick knew he was, he might suspect a smaller figure behind the scenes someone overlooked. Podrick was banking on the fact that neither Tyrion nor Varys would ever seriously believe Podrick capable of such schemes. It was, after all, unthinkable that the shy, stumbling squire might outwit two of the most cunning men in King's Landing. But unthinkable or not, it was happening. Bit by bit, Podrick was lighting fires that threatened to consume them all. And he found himself relishing it, a small smile creeping across his lips when he was alone. He had never dreamed he would feel such power. Even without a title or a name of great repute, he was shaping the fate of the capital from the shadows. Some nights, the enormity of it overwhelmed him, and he shivered in bed, wondering if a blade would find him in the dark. But by daylight he pressed on, unwavering. The next morning, the castle woke to news that Lady Olenna had given an ultimatum. Unless the crown publicly denounced Tyrion's alleged secret dealings and provided reparations to the Tyrells, she would withdraw all support immediately. This threw the royal court into an uproar. Varys tried to mediate, but Olenna was adamant. Marjorie was mortified, wanting to maintain a good relationship with the royal family, but her grandmother wouldn't yield. Meanwhile, Tyrion was forced to defend himself against accusations of forging pacts with bravos. The queen was absent, refusing to see him, and the king, young Tommen, was too beset by other issues to offer clarity. Whispers of chaos spread through the halls. In this frenzy, Varys made his move. Podrick learned through his network of servants that Varys was quietly collecting evidence to prove the letter was a forgery. He interviewed scribes, cross-examined seals, and questioned guards who had carried messages. Podrick's pulse quickened. If Varys discovered the guard who had delivered the letter to Olenna, the thread might lead to Podrick. He hurriedly concocted a story to feed the guard, instructing him to say that someone else, a man in plain clothes, had handed him the letter in the corridor. Pell, the friend Podrick had in the guard, also helped muddy the story, insisting the letter came from an unknown source. Varys pressed, but the guard stuck to his fabricated tale. For the moment, Podrick remained safe. Still, it was clear that Varys suspected foul play outside of Tyrion and Olenna's machinations. He began to suspect a hidden hand. Podrick needed one final stroke to remove Varys from the equation before the spider's webs ensnared him. He decided to exploit Varys's well-known secret, his whispered alliances throughout the city, the presence of his little birds. If Podrick could manufacture evidence that Varys was using children for sinister ends or selling information to foreign powers, the queen might be forced to act. As paranoid as Cersei was, she would pounce on anything that suggested a betrayal. Tyrion, desperate and isolated, might not defend Varys if it meant saving himself. So Podrick set about forging yet another piece of damaging correspondence, this time allegedly sent by Varys to a contact in Pentos, revealing crucial city defenses. The text would also imply that Varys was responsible for the entire fiasco with the Tyrells, that he manipulated them into turning against Tyrion for his own shadowy reasons. If discovered, it would mark Varys as a traitor. Of course, forging Varys's intricate script was no easy task. Podrick could barely approximate it. But he reasoned that the letter need only be found under suspicious circumstances, quickly glimpsed, and recognized by a seal or signature that seemed authentic. The details of the text would be enough to spur an immediate reaction. By the time anyone bothered to check the authenticity in detail, events would already be set in motion. However, Podrick had to be cautious. Varys was cunning, and any direct attempt to frame him might be undone unless done with utmost care. Podrick planned to slip the forged missive into the possession of a guard loyal to Cersei, ensuring it was discovered at a time when Cersei's wrath was at its peak. But before he could carry out this final move, the city erupted into a new crisis. Rumors spread that the Tyrell caravans had halted at the city gates, refusing to unload supplies. Bread prices soared overnight, and hungry crowds poured into the streets, demanding relief. Tension burst into violence near the Gate of the Gods, where a mob ransacked a supply wagon. The gold cloaks tried to intervene, and blood spilled. The next morning, corpses lay in the gutter, and the small folk seethed, blaming the Lannisters and the Tyrells in equal measure. Inside the Red Keep, panic reigned. The king's advisors argued over how to quell the unrest. Tyrion demanded that the Tyrells honor their earlier promises, while Olenna scoffed at the notion of sending supplies into a city governed by a traitorous imp. Marjorie pleaded for reason, but the old woman was unyielding. Varys flitted from council member to council member, attempting damage control, but the situation was spiraling too fast. Podrick watched with a quiet sense of triumph. He had set these events in motion. Now they were gaining momentum all their own. But as chaos crested, Podrick realized he must strike decisively or risk losing his chance. Tyrion might be deposed or flee the city if the situation worsened. Varys might vanish into the night if threatened. Podrick wanted them both to fall within the confines of King's Landing, in a way that ensured the outcome benefited him. So, on the day the riots claimed half a dozen more lives, Podrick carefully inserted the forged letter into the pocket of a guard known to be in Cersei's confidence. He timed it so that the guard would discover it, poking out of his pocket as if accidentally misplaced, right before the guard was set to meet Cersei for his daily report. The letter bore a crude approximation of Varys's personal seal, stolen from bits of wax Podrick had found on an old document. The text implicated Varys in fomenting the Tyrell dispute. Podrick didn't witness the discovery itself, but he imagined the guard's shock, the hurried confusion as he brought the letter to Cersei. And sure enough, within the hour, the Red Keep was on high alert. Podrick observed from a distance as Lannister guards rushed about, searching for Varys. A rumor circulated that the queen herself had ordered Varys's detention for questioning. It was said she was livid, cursing Tyrion and Varys in the same breath, claiming the pair conspired to bring the city to ruin. Podrick smiled to himself. His plan to paint them as allies in treachery seemed to be working. The queen's paranoia would do the rest. Yet capturing Varys was not so easy. Varys had contingencies, safe passages known only to him. By the time the guards reached his chambers, the spider was gone. Some said he fled through a secret tunnel, others that he disguised himself and walked out the front gate. Regardless, he vanished. The queen was left unsatisfied, Tyrion found himself under deeper suspicion, and the city remained on the brink of catastrophe. Some said Cersei would have Tyrion arrested next, but for now, she merely confined him to the Red Keep. Tyrion, for his part, raged that someone was framing him, that the letter forging was obviously not his or Varys's doing. But with Varys gone, there was no one to corroborate his innocence. Podrick realized that events had turned even more in his favor than he had dared hope. Varys had fled, effectively self-exiling. Tyrion was politically crippled, pinned in the Red Keep without allies, and Lady Olenna, furious and emboldened, was on the verge of finalizing her withdrawal from the city, leaving the Lannisters to starve and riot. In the confusion, no one suspected Podrick as the true architect. Late that night, Podrick ventured onto a secluded balcony overlooking the Blackwater Bay. The moonlight silvered the dark waters. He reflected on his remarkable transformation. From the shy, bumbling squire who spilled wine at banquets to the hidden hand that had toppled two of the most cunning players in King's Landing. It was exhilarating, terrifying, and strangely lonely. He had no confidants, no mentors. This was his burden alone. But he also recognized the immense freedom in it. He could choose his next move without constraint. He leaned against the cold stone balustrade, breathing in the salt air. The city below him was restless, lights flickering in windows even at this late hour. Somewhere out there, small folk wept for their dead, soldiers nursed bruises from the riots, and highborn lords plotted their next gambit. Podrick felt oddly calm, his path illuminated by the chaos he had sown. He had prepared a false identity for himself, should he need to leave the city, a simple set of clothes and forged travel papers under a different name. If everything collapsed, he could vanish into the countryside, or book passage on a ship to Essos. But before he did, he wanted to see if he could leverage his success into a position of genuine power within the city. Perhaps he would approach Lady Olenna, reveal some portion of the truth, and offer to serve as her agent if she decided to return with her grain shipments. Or he might approach Cersei, claiming to have discovered new evidence of Tyrion's treachery, thus cementing his favor with the Queen. And there was still the question of the vacant position left by Varys. Who would gather intelligence for the realm now that the Master of Whisperers had fled? It was a role that required cunning, subtlety, and an extensive network, qualities Podrick had learned to cultivate. He could envision himself stepping into Varys's shoes, albeit with a different style, forging an alliance with a new set of little birds. The notion seemed impossible at first blush, but hadn't everything he'd accomplished so far been impossible? Yes, he could do it. Podrick's heart pounded with the realization. If the Queen or whoever held power next needed a Master of Whisperers, they would look to someone who already possessed inside knowledge, who had proven adept at rooting out conspiracies. He could easily claim to have discovered Tyrion's and Varys's collusion. Podrick had the advantage of being an unexpected candidate. Let them scoff. Let them underestimate him. By the time they realized his competence, he would be firmly entrenched. He closed his eyes, recalling the boy he used to be. A boy who stammered out apologies for every misstep, who blushed at the mention of women, who idolized Tyrion and believed he was only fit to be a loyal helper. That boy was gone, replaced by someone else, someone with a steely core. The transformation thrilled him. The next morning, Podrick presented himself at the door of the Queen's chambers. The guards tried to shoo him away, but he insisted he had vital information regarding the recent disruptions. One guard slammed the door in his face, calling him a mere squire. Podrick waited in the corridor, refusing to leave, stoic as the hours passed. Finally, one of Cersei's ladies-in-waiting took pity on him and asked what he wanted. Podrick claimed he possessed evidence that could incriminate Tyrion further and secure the crown's position against the Tyrells. Intrigued, the lady brought him inside. Cersei sat in a high-backed chair, draped in black silk, her golden hair coiled with faint streaks of silver. Her eyes bored into Podrick as if to strip away every secret he carried. "What do you know of your master's treachery, boy?" she demanded, her voice frigid. Podrick bent his knee, bowing so low that his head nearly touched the floor. He offered up a meek countenance, though inside, he felt a wild surge of anticipation. "Your Grace, I come only to serve. I have stumbled upon certain letters, certain alliances. I believe Lord Tyrion has conspired with the Tyrells to undermine the crown, even as he pretends to negotiate." Cersei's eyes narrowed. "You are Tyrion's squire. Why would you betray him?" Podrick let his voice tremble, letting a practiced quiver enter his tone. "I have seen enough to know he does not care for me. He never has, and I cannot stand by while he sows chaos in your realm, Your Grace. I only wish to protect the city from further bloodshed." Cersei's gaze remained icy, but Podrick saw a flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. This was exactly what she wanted to hear. A disillusioned servant coming forward to confirm her darkest suspicions. "Go on," she said softly. "Tell me everything." Podrick launched into a carefully curated story of how Tyrion had arranged shady meetings with Braavosi bankers, how he manipulated the Tyrells' demands, all of which aligned with the rumors that had already circulated. He embellished details to make Tyrion look even more unscrupulous, careful to keep his own role invisible. Cersei listened intently, occasionally asking pointed questions. Podrick answered with just enough detail to be convincing, but not so much as to incriminate himself in forging letters. By the end, Cersei's lips curled into a grim smile. "You have served me well by bringing this forward," she said. "I will see that you are rewarded for your loyalty." Podrick bowed again. "Thank you, Your Grace. I only wish to serve the crown. If there is any way I can be of further assistance, I humbly offer my skills. I have learned much about the comings and goings in the Red Keep." Cersei considered him. There was a pause heavy with implication. Then she said, "We shall speak again soon." With a dismissive gesture, she waved him out. Podrick withdrew, his heart pounding with victory. A foot in the door. The Queen would keep an eye on him, certainly, but he had opened the possibility of stepping into a more influential role. Before long, she might rely on him as an informant, especially if Tyrion fell from grace entirely. And if he proved valuable, who knew how high he might rise? As the day wore on, events unfolded quickly. Cersei summoned Tyrion to a private audience, confronted him with accusations that he was sabotaging the crown. Tyrion, outraged, demanded proof, only to find that proof was conveniently missing or reliant on rumors. Cersei insisted that no one but Tyrion could have orchestrated the fiasco with the Tyrells. After all, Varys had disappeared, presumably in fear of being caught. Tyrion must have done something dreadful to chase the Master of Whisperers into hiding. And so the circle of doubt closed around Tyrion, leaving him scrambling to defend himself. Podrick watched from a distance, careful not to draw attention. The crowds in the streets still rioted over bread. The Tyrells threatened to depart, and the Queen was fully focused on crushing Tyrion. At any moment, the city might erupt into open revolt if supplies failed to arrive. And it was all the product of Podrick's machinations, a carefully laid labyrinth of half-truths and forged letters. He felt a heady mixture of terror and pride. That night, he snuck to a corner of the Red Keep's ramparts, overlooking the flickering lights of King's Landing. He let the warm night wind brush across his face, gazing down upon the city he had helped to destabilize. Tomorrow, or the day after, or the next, Tyrion might be arrested, tried, or exiled. Or perhaps the Tyrells would decide to use the unrest to stage a more forceful takeover. Perhaps other lords would sense the weakness of the crown. Regardless, the old order was weakening, and new opportunities beckoned. Podrick allowed himself a private smile. He was no one's squire now. In his heart, he was already the master of his own destiny. And if King's Landing needed a new whisperer, someone to slip between the cracks of power, then Podrick Payne was ready. He had outwitted Tyrion and Varys. He had pitted the Tyrells against the Lannisters. He had ignited chaos with a few careful nudges. And he was only just beginning. He stood there a long while, imagining all that might come next, feeling the pulse of the city in the distance. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to dream of holding genuine influence, of shaping the realm's fate. He thought of the fear in Tyrion's eyes when confronted by Olenna, of the frustration in Varys's voice when he realized he was being hunted, of the anger in Cersei's glare as she tightened her grip on the throne. And he, Podrick Payne, was the unnoticed puppet master. When at last he returned to his chamber, dawn was breaking. The first light glimmered over the rooftops, illuminating the city's stone walls with a soft glow. Podrick eased off his boots, sank onto his straw mattress, and closed his eyes. Sleep took him, filled with vivid dreams of a crown balanced on the edge of a dagger, spinning, and his own hand reaching out to steady it. In the days to come, whether the city rose or fell, whether Tyrion died or escaped, Podrick Payne was determined to remain 3 steps ahead, guiding events from the shadows. He would stoke the fires of upheaval, extinguish them when it suited him, and perhaps one day even ascend to a station he once believed impossible. A shy squire no longer. He was the hidden hand of King's Landing, and no one would see him coming until it was far too late.